Now, we already looked at offers and acceptances and consideration for contracts generally in the module on contracts. Now, the Uniform Commercial Code has some slight variations that I want to address with regard to the sales of goods. So with regard to offers, option contracts are handled a little bit differently. And if you'll recall, an option contract is when the offeror agrees to keep the offer open for some extra period of time within which the acceptance is still valid. And generally for contracts, there has to be extra consideration given in order to turn what would otherwise be just a normal offer into an option contract that's left open. But in the merchant context with regard to the UCC, a written offer from a merchant cannot be revoked for whatever time is specified in the offer or a reasonable time. So when a merchant makes you an offer, you have a reasonable amount of time to accept that offer. It cannot be revoked, even if you didn't provide extra consideration. With regard to acceptance, the important points are, first of all, there's no mirror image rule. So when merchants are dealing with each other, if one offers a form contract and then the other one agrees with their form contract and the forms don't exactly match each other, as long as in the main the parties are in agreement on all of the core substantive terms, courts will deem that to be an acceptance. Now, if the buyer takes the goods, having purchased them, and does not reject them as non-conforming within a reasonable period of time, that is deemed to be acceptance in the goods context. So if you take goods, you don't reject them, then that counts as acceptance, even if you never formally accept. And there's a thing called the perfect tender rule. So there's no concept of substantial performance. If you recall, I used the example of someone painting a fence, and they basically paint all of it, but they leave a little corner of it out. Under common law contracts, you could have a concept of substantial performance. They've basically done it, and as a result, you as the promisor cannot renege on your promise because they performed most of what they were supposed to do. In the goods context, there is a thing called the perfect tender rule, which means there's no substantial performance. If you provide goods that, for whatever reason, don't conform, the buyer has the ability to reject those goods, to reject some of the goods, but there is no concept of substantial performance where the buyer is still on the hook. The only exception to that is if it's an installment contract that's being sold in multiple lots, multiple installments, then the seller is given the ability to cure whatever the deficiency is in the way the goods have been provided. Now, separate from installment contracts, the seller also has a right to cure if the goods were provided before the delivery date. So if you provide the goods before the delivery date, the buyer says the goods are non-conforming, the seller can try to cure that by providing conforming goods by the delivery date. But if it's after the delivery date, a cure is only possible if the seller reasonably believes that the buyer would accept those goods with a price adjustment involved. And so the cure would provide the goods, but would provide the goods with some sort of a price adjustment. So if you provide the goods before the time that they're due, you have time to cure. But if you don't, and you only provide them, let's say, on the day they're due, and then it turns out that they're non-conforming, then you've lost your ability to cure unless you're willing and able to provide a price adjustment and you believe that the buyer would accept that. The buyer is under no obligation to accept that. The buyer can, in general, revoke acceptance if the goods are non-conforming, they affect the value, and the nonconformity was difficult to discover initially, or there was no cure made, and then a notice of revocation was made within a reasonable time after the discovery. Then the buyer can say, forget it, I'm going to return the goods. And we see that all the time with regard to consumer purchases, where you buy something, you bring it home, and then you can come back when you discover that the nonconformity, let's say the product doesn't perform the way it was advertised or something like that. When the nonconformity wasn't initially discoverable, but it's discoverable later, you then can return it and revoke your acceptance. Now, another feature of UCC contracts that are a little different from the common law contracts regime is if the buyer's acceptance contains additional terms. Generally speaking, if the buyer accepts the offer but adds terms, that's treated as a proposal, not new terms necessarily, just a proposal for new terms, unless both parties are merchants. Now, if both parties are merchants, then those new terms actually become part of the contract automatically, so long as the change is not material and the parties can just go along their way. This is really a variation on the idea that there's no mirror image rule. So if one party offers terms and another one responds and says, yes, that's fine, here are my terms, and they're a little bit different, but they're different in immaterial ways, as long as they're both merchants and therefore customary buyers and sellers of goods, sophisticated parties, then the proposal simply becomes part of the contract and it's no big deal. Unless, for whatever reason, the original offer said you have to accept these precise terms. Then that's the only way they can be accepted. But in general, when merchants are working with each other, the idea is as long as they basically agree on the core stuff, we're not going to worry so much if some of the details in their back and forth with each other don't exactly match. Now, if the buyer's acceptance contains new terms that are different from the original terms that were offered by the seller, some courts will treat that also as a proposal that can either be accepted or not. Some courts will say, you've accepted and we're going to disregard those new terms that you tacked on. And some courts will apply what's called a knockout rule, which says both the new terms and the old terms that were originally in it, they're both knocked out because nobody agreed to the new terms, but nobody agreed to the old terms either because they were offered by the seller and never accepted by the buyer. And so both get knocked out. It's a little bit unclear exactly how courts will handle a situation where the buyer accepts the contract, but at the same time adds new terms to the contract. Now, with regard to modification of contracts under the UCC, UCC contracts can, in general, be modified in good faith, and you don't need extra consideration for doing it. Under most common law contracts, you would need additional consideration for the modification, but not in the UCC context. Also, you recall that under the statute of frauds, if there's a contract for the sale of goods over $500, that has to be in writing. But the UCC actually will enforce even oral agreements as long as the goods have been delivered and accepted. And that makes sense because the statute of frauds, as you'll recall, is really about making sure that for certain kinds of contracts, we're confident that a real contract was formed, and so for those, we don't allow oral contracts. But in this case, if there's an oral agreement, goods get delivered pursuant to the oral agreement, goods get accepted pursuant to the oral agreement. We don't really have any concerns that an agreement wasn't formed because both parties are acting as if an agreement was formed, and so the statute of frauds doesn't apply.